What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch back here with another Stardom and Situm. It's for week number 2 of the 2019 NFL season. Here to give you my 5 starts, my 5 sits at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position for week number 2 of the 2019 season. But before I give you my favorite matchups of the week and before I give you my least favorite matchups of the week, spike the like button, subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more fantasy football videos just like this, and comment below your opinion. What matchups do you love? What matchups do you hate? And what questions do you have for me? What start-sit questions do you have that I don't answer in this video? And guys, just so you know, I don't give you the easy starts. I don't give you the easy sits. I go with the tough decisions, the borderline decisions, not like a lot of these other fantasy analysts out there who will just give you the easy starts or the easy sits. I'm here to give you the difficult decisions. All right, at the quarterback position, let's start off with the starts. And it all starts on Thursday Night Football with Cam Newton versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Cam Newton versus the Bucs. I understand he didn't have a good game against the Rams. He didn't look like the normal Cam Newton that we all know and love, but I expect to see that Cam Newton on Thursday Night Football as Cam Newton plays the team that he has more touchdowns against than any other team in the NFL. He usually tears apart the Bucs. This is the team that he performs the best against. Plus, it's at home. It's on Thursday Night Football. It's Cam Newton in prime time, but not only Cam Newton in prime time, but the short week. The Bucs won't have a great game plan going into this game. I expect Cam Newton to have a massive bounce-back game on Thursday night. Usually, when there's a bad Cam game, he follows it up with a good Cam game. So I expect to see Super Cam on Thursday Night Football. The next matchup I do love at the quarterback position this week is Dak Prescott versus the Washington Redskins. Super impressed by Dak Prescott in week 1, and I listed him as a start last week. I was correct, but I didn't expect what we saw in week 1, even against the Giants. This was a completely different, more creative, Kellen Moore-led offense from the Dallas Cowboys. They were passing the ball more, which is positive for Dak Prescott. I called that, by the way. And this week versus the Redskins, you can expect another good performance from your boy Dak. Dak is playing a Redskins secondary that's just not very good. I mean, look at what Carson Wentz did to them in basically only half of a game when they started so slow. So Dak Prescott should be able to hit big plays to Michael Gallup, to Amari Cooper. I expect the Cowboys to win this game. I expect the Cowboys to cover in this game, and I expect the Cowboys to put up a lot of points. The Redskins, they can't match up with these Cowboys receivers on the outside. I love the amount of play action that we've seen, and Ezekiel Elliott on his second week back with the team is only going to be better, which allows the passing game to hit even more downfield shots. So I love Dak Prescott once again against another NFC East foe. Josh Allen versus the New York Giants. Now, we saw what Dak Prescott did against the New York Giants. I expect Josh Allen to have a very good game in this one. Josh Allen, he had those turnovers last week. He wasn't horrible for fantasy purposes last week, but he certainly wasn't great the way he finished last season. I expect him to have one of those type of games where he possibly goes over 50 yards rushing, where he possibly goes over 250 yards passing. I expect Josh Allen to have one of his best games ever passing the football in this one because the Giants, their secondary is awful. We saw that last week. They can't really tackle in the secondary. They don't have a ton of speed. And speaking of speed, the one guy that has speed for the Buffalo Bills is John Brown. Expect John Brown and Josh Allen to hook up with at least one big play in this game. Cole Beasley should have a matchup in this game that favors him as well. I really like Josh Allen this week. He didn't really find his rhythm till later in the second half of the Jets game. Expect that to carry over versus the Giants. Big Ben versus Seattle. I know, Big Ben did not have a good game in week 1, but he played the Patriots. He played the best secondary in football, and he played one of the top defenses at home, raising the banner. They're just was a lot of bad things going the wrong direction for Big Ben. And I told you so going into last week. But this week, he should turn it around. Seattle is not a very good pass defense. They're not a very good defense in general, especially when they're on the road. Big Ben always plays better at home. This is the opening game for Pittsburgh at home. Juju Smith-Schuster should not have Stephon Gilmore on him, so that definitely helps versus Seattle. Seattle gave up a ton of big plays to Cincinnati last week. Big plays to John Ross. Just overall, Andy Dalton was able to shred them up and down the field. I expect Big Ben to have time in the pocket because Seattle doesn't have much of a pass rush. I expect Juju to have a good game. I expect Vance McDonald to be more involved. I just expect overall this offense to hit at a higher rate, especially after a game in week 1 where they were seriously underwhelming. They're coming into this game with a lot of motivation, so I really love Big Ben versus Seattle in this game. And my last start at the quarterback position is Derek Carr. Derek Carr played very, very well. He was impressive versus Denver, and that's a defense that coming into this season I was super high on. I guess that wasn't the case in week 1 because Derek Carr looked really good. He looked like the 2016 Derek Carr. John Gruden, I was impressed with his play calling. I was impressed with the offensive scheme. I was impressed with Darren Waller and Tyrell Williams and Josh Jacobs. I was impressed with the offensive line, and Derek Carr was getting the ball out quickly. Now he plays Kansas City, a defense that really gets shredded all the time, and it doesn't matter the opponent. Kansas City does not have a good secondary. Their pass rush was underwhelming last week versus the Jaguars, and this week it's in Oakland once again for Carr. Carr typically does play well versus the Chiefs, and I expect him to have another good game here with a lot of good matchups with his weapons, with Williams and Waller and Jacobs. I really like Derek Carr to be in a shootout with Patrick Mahomes this week against the Chiefs. Now, the quarterback sits. We start with Kyler Murray. Now, I listed Kyler Murray as a sit last week, so I will tell you that I was pretty wrong about that one, but I was pretty right for about 3/4, and then the Detroit Lions just completely unraveled. I don't expect that to happen versus Baltimore, a defense that's even better than the Lions defense, a defense that will not let up. There's going to be a lot of pressure after Kyler in this game, and I don't expect this game to be close. I think the spread's around 13.5, 14 right now. That should be about the margin of victory for Baltimore. They are a powerful defense. They're going to be send blitzes. They're great in the secondary with great man-to-man coverage. Earl Thomas looks like he's back. Just Baltimore is not a defense that I'd like to start any quarterback against, especially a rookie that's going to see a lot of things that he's seen for the first time. Kirk Cousins versus Green Bay. Cousins is a solid quarterback, but they don't pass the ball enough right now in Minnesota. 98 passing yards versus Atlanta. Green Bay has a better secondary than Atlanta. I understand that the Vikings went out to a big lead. I expect this game to be a little bit closer. I could see it going either way in terms of the actual football game, and Kirk Cousins should see higher numbers in this game, but Green Bay looked legit as a defense last week, and I expect this game to be a low-scoring affair between the Vikings and Green Bay, so I just don't love Cousins this week in week 2. Jameis Winston versus Carolina. Winston is a turnover machine. You never know what to expect from him, and that's why I can't be trustworthy with him. I can't start him with a fantasy week and a fantasy victory on the line. I just don't know if I'm going to get bad Jameis or good Jameis. And versus a defense in Carolina that I think is pretty darn good, they only let up they were good against the Rams. They were good against Jared Goff. Go back, watch that game, go look at the statistics. 17 points, 13 or 17 points were off turnovers or bad plays by the Carolina offense. This week, that's probably not likely to happen for Tampa Bay. I expect their defense to play just as well as they did against the Rams, except it's against a worse offense with a worse quarterback, a worse running game, and worse receivers. So overall, I am going to say that Jameis should sit on the bench. Aaron Rodgers versus Minnesota. Aaron Rodgers typically in the past has been up and down versus Minnesota, and really over the past 3 seasons, he hasn't been the best versus the Vikings. He has had 1 or 2 games in there where he has performed, and I know this is bold that you don't usually sit Aaron Rodgers in fantasy, but I'm telling you, he does not have a very high ceiling in this game. This game is going to be low scoring. I love what I saw from the Vikings defense versus Atlanta. They were all over Matt Ryan. They were all over the receivers from front to back. this secondary, this defensive line. The defensive line was terrorizing Matt Ryan. And if they get any pressure on Aaron Rodgers, I just don't love this matchup whatsoever. Plus, the Packers offense looks kind of one-dimensional. It looks Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, and not very creative. I don't love what I've seen so far from the LaFleur experiment in Green Bay. Now, it is in Lambeau Field, so I understand if you do start him. I just don't think this is the biggest upside play, and I'd prefer to play one of the guys I have in the start section. Phillip Rivers versus the Detroit Lions. This might be a surprising one, and I did have the Detroit Lions defense as a sit-em last week in terms of playing Kyler Murray, but when I look at Phillip Rivers, I don't know if Mike Williams is playing. Hunter Henry is not playing. Really, the only trustworthy receiver Phillip Rivers has is Keenan Allen, and I do believe that the Lions will spend a lot of preparation in trying to take him out of this game, with Darius Slay probably matching up on him. Now you're trusting players like Dontrell Inman, who's coming back to the Chargers after a long offseason, not even on the team. He was on the Patriots for much of the offseason. You're looking at a Travis Benjamin, who's been very hit and miss. He's a big play, or he disappears. They'll probably try and run the ball a little bit more. They'll get their backs involved, but I just don't see high ceiling for Phillip Rivers this week in a game that is on the road, in a game that he doesn't have his weapons, and the offensive line is banged up. I don't see this going very well for Phillip Rivers. Now to the running back position, starting off with the starts. Matt Breida versus Cincinnati. I listed him as a start last week. Pretty much a letdown last week versus Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay did a lot better against the run than I did expect in week 1. But versus Cincinnati, the reason why you start Breida is because Tevin Coleman is not there, and he is going to be basically the workhorse for this offense. Of course that they're going to get Raheem Mostert the ball as well, but I do believe that Breida is going to be the lead guy. He's going to get more third down play now out of the backfield as a receiver. I think they're going to just try and run the ball a little bit more. And the Seahawks did have a fair amount of success versus Cincinnati. I do expect Matt to have a good game in this one. If the 49ers are going to win this game or at least make it close, I do believe that they're going to need to run the ball. So Matt Breida is here on my start list. Sony Michel versus Miami. He had a really bad week versus Pittsburgh, but for whatever reason, the last 2 seasons, he hasn't played very well versus Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh has done a good job against the New England running game over the past few years. I do expect versus Miami, a team that Michel basically destroyed last season, I expect Michel to have a bounce back game. He looked great in the preseason. I'm still very high on him as a season-long player, so I expect him to have his first big game this week. Plus, if the Patriots are running out the clock late in this game, which they probably should, they're minus 19 points according to Vegas in this one, 19-point favorites. Sony Michel should touch the ball near the goal line a ton and should touch the ball in the fourth quarter running out the clock. Austin Ekeler versus Detroit. I brought up Phillip Rivers with the lack of weapons. Well, that puts more pressure on Austin Ekeler to produce, and that gives Austin Ekeler more touches. Specifically in the receiving game where he was awesome last week versus the Colts, I expect that to carry over as Detroit does not have great cover linebackers, and Ekeler should be able to beat them in space. They also utilize him very well in the screen game. I expect that to carry over as well. Ekeler was great on the ground as well last week versus the Colts, who have a comparable defense to Detroit. I expect Ekeler to have another awesome game, so you should definitely start him if you had any doubts. Miles Sanders versus Atlanta. Now, the biggest reason I'm starting Miles Sanders, even after kind of an okay-ish game last week, not the greatest if you started Miles Sanders last week, I expect a big game this week because he plays the Atlanta Falcons front, a front that allowed 125-plus rushing yards in just the first half versus Dalvin Cook and the Minnesota Vikings. Sanders, the Eagles, they're going to want to pound the ball on the road in Atlanta. This is the weakness of Atlanta's defense, and I expect Sanders to have a big day. Also, I would expect him to have a big day as a receiver, as Atlanta does play traditionally that Seattle-based scheme defense, which allows a lot of receptions to the running back. Singletary versus the Giants, kind of my surprise start of the week, but if you're in need of a flex and you have him on my roster, or your roster, I should say, you should definitely start Devin Singletary this week. Look at what he did last week in the limited amount of opportunities. But it was crazy because he had limited amount of opportunities to touch the actual football, but he was out there more than a Frank Gore. He was actually the starting running back last week, and I expect Buffalo to run the ball more this week versus the Giants. First, I think that they will be in the lead, or at least the game will be close for a majority of the game. Last week, you have to remember that Buffalo was trying to come back in the game a lot, which didn't allow Singletary to really touch the ball as much. So I expect Devin to have a big week this week versus the Giants and really have his breakout game in the NFL. My running back sits. Let's start off with Devontae Freeman versus Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a good run stuffing defensive line. They're a good defensive line in general. Devontae Freeman did not look like his explosive self last week. I just didn't really like what I saw from him versus the Vikings. He didn't look like his old self. And versus Philadelphia, Fletcher Cox, and all the big guys they have up front, it's going to be difficult to run versus the Eagles. But I do see Atlanta trying to pass the ball a lot and probably having success in that area of their game. So I would sit Devontae Freeman this week. If you have some good running backs, I understand you probably don't have a choice and you're going to have to start him at least in a flex spot. But if I did have the weapons or the variety on my roster, I would probably go elsewhere this week. The Denver running backs versus Chicago. We know the Bears defense can stop the run. We saw it last week. We saw it last season. It's been a pretty consistent thing. Denver did not run the ball particularly well versus Oakland, and that was against Oakland, not the Bears. The Bears will dominate the line of scrimmage versus Denver's mediocre to weak offensive line. I expect the Denver running backs to not have a very good week. Maybe they catch some passes, but I don't see it having a very high ceiling. Aaron Jones versus Minnesota. Aaron Jones had an okay week against Chicago in Chicago standards, and he did touch the ball is what I'm trying to say. But even if he does get those attempts, those opportunities, it's Minnesota. I mean, Minnesota has done a good job versus the run. Like I said, Devontae Freeman had nowhere to go. Aaron Jones is a similar style type of player. And yeah, maybe Green Bay tries to run the ball a little bit more this week, but I just don't see how that is really going to be a big game. Unless he breaks one big run, which is entirely possible, I don't see Aaron Jones having a big week versus the Vikings front seven. That's one of the best in the game. Adrian Peterson versus Dallas. Adrian Peterson is a running back that the Redskins use when they're winning or when they're close in a game, when they need to grind it out. Darius Geis is gone, so that's why you would consider starting Adrian Peterson, but this is more of a Thompson week as the Dallas Cowboys should probably win this game and win this game comfortably versus the Redskins, meaning that Adrian Peterson won't touch the ball very much on the ground if the Cowboys do jump out to an early lead. Ronald Jones versus Carolina. Jones had a pretty good week last week, especially by his standards, versus the San Francisco 49ers, and looked like the best back on their roster. So that's a positive thing going forward. But Carolina overall is a good front against the run, specifically with their front seven. Very much like I said with Minnesota and Dallas. I mean, they're just a really talented, fast group of players up front. Luke Kuechly, you have big bodies up front with Poe, Short, McCoy, and Ronald Jones. I just don't expect him having a lot of success on the ground. Specifically, I also think that this is going to be a game where Carolina is probably leading for much of it, meaning that they're passing more, which means that Ronald Jones probably won't be in there to run the football. The wide receiver starts of the week. Let's start off with the ever questionable Antonio Brown. Now, if Antonio Brown plays, you start him. So this is a Sunday thing. If Antonio Brown plays, I don't care if he's on a limited snap count, against the Miami Dolphins, he has a chance to go off for a touchdown or two, even if he has limited snaps with Tom Brady and on this Patriots offense, because Antonio Brown is both that good, and the Patriots are that good, where they can create plays with Antonio Brown out there. Now, if he doesn't play, obviously you don't play him, but now this start kind of shifts into Philip Dorsett territory, where you start to think, hey, maybe Philip Dorsett is a startable option, because if Antonio Brown is not playing, Philip Dorsett once again regains his role from week 1, where he had a big game against the Steelers. You look at what Baltimore was able to do with downfield passes to guys like Marquise Brown. Philip Dorsett, very similar receiver. So maybe you start Philip Dorsett instead of an Antonio Brown. Michael Gallup versus Washington looked uber impressive week 1 versus the Giants. I expect that to carry over versus Washington, a secondary that's very slow, not good versus the pass, and the player that did go off last week was Deshaun Jackson for the Eagles. If there is a receiver that's built similarly to Deshaun Jackson on the Cowboys, it is Michael Gallup, more of the downfield deep threat. Amari Cooper should have a day, but also Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup has become their second option in their passing game in Dallas, and like I said with Dak, they are passing the ball more. John Brown versus the Giants. I hinted at this earlier with Josh Allen, but John Brown should have a big play here. The Giants have slow corners. They are not going to be able to keep up with. That's the biggest thing. That's the best thing that John Brown does, is speed down the field. And he had a huge week last week versus the Jets. Josh Allen will be looking for him. Nobody loves to pass the ball downfield more than Josh Allen. So when they're running the ball, getting that going, hit the big play to John Brown. I expect that to happen versus the Giants. Sammy Watkins versus Oakland. Now that Tyreek Hill is out, Sammy Watkins had his big game versus Jacksonville. I expect him to be a number 1 type of receiver in fantasy this week, so have no questions about him repeating his performance. He should see a ton of volume. He should see the number 1 type of targets, and Sammy Watkins should have a great game versus Oakland, specifically if Garyon Connolly is also out in this game, which opens up Sammy Watkins for a better matchup one-on-one. Tyrell Williams is the last start at the wide receiver position. Tyrell Williams was awesome versus a good secondary in Denver. Now he plays one of, if not the worst secondary in football in Kansas City, and he should have another great game. Him and Derek Carr seem to have very good chemistry, seem to be on the same page. John Gruden is putting him in very good positions to make plays, and he's also their downfield threat, which I love. So Tyrell Williams should have a nice game here versus Kansas City. The wide receiver sits. Let's continue to sit Robbie Anderson. He's playing another very difficult matchup, another very difficult corner in Denzel Ward. Denzel Ward allowed zero yards versus Corey Davis last week. I expect that to be very similar versus Robbie Anderson. Maybe he has 2 or 3 catches, but I don't expect the big plays to be there with Sam Darnold out at quarterback. Christian Kirk versus Baltimore. I said it, Baltimore has probably the second best secondary in the league. They are a great defense. I don't see the Cardinals scoring very many points in this game. And even though there were some positive signs from Kirk in week 1, this is just not the matchup to put him in your lineup for. Emmanuel Sanders versus Chicago. Emmanuel Sanders, he did some things at the end of that game versus Oakland, and I expected him to have a bigger game than he did. But Joe Flacco is just a quarterback that, for fantasy production, it doesn't seem like these two things line up. Joe Flacco was not willing to throw the ball down the field until around the 4th quarter, until they were losing by enough points where it was necessary. And versus a Chicago defense that I think is going to dominate this offensive line of the Broncos, I don't see how this is a good matchup, especially if Fuller is on Sanders for a majority of the game. T.Y. Hilton versus the Titans. Now, this is a surprise sit, but the Titans have a very good secondary. They're great in pass coverage. They looked very impressive versus one of the best pass offenses in Cleveland in week 1. And even though T.Y. Hilton is phenomenal, even though he is a beast, I do warn you that if you are starting T.Y. Hilton, I would have some other guys in there that I do trust to at least put up some floor type of production so that you can play the ceiling play of T.Y. Hilton. Because this week, I feel like he is rather going to be boom or bust. He's rather going to hit 1 or 2 big plays, or he's going to be completely invisible. I expect Dean Pease and Mike Vrabel to try and take him out of this game scheme-wise. That's why I say sit T.Y. Hilton. And my last sit of the week is Valdez Scantling versus Minnesota. Valdez Scantling looked pretty good in a couple of plays versus the Chicago Bears, but this week versus Minnesota, in a game that I expect to be low scoring, it's just not the biggest, highest ceiling that you would expect from Valdez Scantling or from the Packers offense this week. I expect this game to be low scoring. That means Valdez Scantling probably not likely to get in the end zone, probably not likely for a ton of yards. I think this game plays out similarly to the Bears game with the Packers, but just a little bit more scoring to it. So Plus, Devontae Adams has also secretly, quietly dominated his matchup versus Xavier Rhodes, which means that that's not really a big issue, and it's not like Rodgers is going to be forcing him the football. So Scantling, even though I like him for the rest of the season, I don't feel like this is a great start this week. And my tight end starts, let's start off with the rookie phenom TJ Hockenson versus LA. Now, the Chargers, it's not like they give up a ton of yards or anything to the tight end position because they really don't, but TJ Hockenson is just so special. He's so gifted. I think he's already one of the top 10 tight ends in the league, and TJ Hockenson was fed the ball regularly. They were putting him in position to make plays, and I expect that to continue, and I expect TJ Hockenson to be a top 12 tight end this year in fantasy. Andrews versus Arizona. Arizona really struggled with TJ Hockenson last week. I expect them to struggle with a very similar type player in Mark Andrews. Andrews had an excellent game last week. I do believe he's the number one target in this passing game in terms of volume, and I expect that to carry over versus Arizona. Maybe not the big plays that he had versus Miami, but he should see a lot of volume versus the Cardinals. Darren Waller versus Kansas City. Like I said, Kansas City secondary is not very good, and Darren Waller was being peppered with footballs, specifically in the red area and on third down. John Gruden seems to put him in position to get a mismatch or get him one-on-one or feed him the football in big situations, and Darren Waller is going to continue to be that guy for Derek Carr. Derek Carr trusts him. He had 7 catches, 70 yards last week. I expect a very similar stat line, if not better, versus the Chiefs. Vance McDonald versus Seattle had a horrendous week 1, but this week I expect him to have a good game because the Cincinnati Bengals tight ends had close to 100 yards total. They should use Vance McDonald. Plus, they need that second weapon to step up. It could be Vance McDonald in Pittsburgh for Big Ben. And Vernon Davis versus the Dallas Cowboys. Dallas, if they did give up anything versus the Giants, it was receptions and yards to the tight end position in Evan Ingram. I expect Davis, who had a good week 1, to carry that over into week 2. He's just a reliable guy, and with Jordan Reed out, Vernon Davis becomes one of the top targets on this offense. And if they are trying to come back in this game and there's garbage time, Vernon Davis will be a guy to eat up those garbage time fantasy points. Those are my starts. Those are my sits for the 2019 Week 2 of your fantasy season. Gronk, spike the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and again, comment below any questions you have for me. It's Mitch of the Bottom Line View.